The houses on Eldritch Gardens had always been the same. Elias Marsh had lived on the street long enough to stop noticing this. The way every gable matched every other gable. The way each front walk measured exactly 11 steps from the sidewalk to the door. The way the lawns grew to a uniform 2 inches and no further, as though the grass understood its obligations. He had moved in 8 years ago, following a divorce that had left him wanting somewhere simple, somewhere without surprises. Eldritch Gardens had delivered. Number 38 was his home, tucked between the Pattersons on the left and the empty lot of number 36 on the right, and the street went on in both directions, in a long white monotony that he had learned to find comforting. Then, one Tuesday in late October, someone moved into number 42. Elias noticed the truck first. Not a moving company van, but a flatbed, hauling what appeared to be equipment in canvas-wrapped bundles, the shape suggesting neither furniture nor boxes, but something else entirely. Instruments, perhaps, or machinery, all of it bound in dark cloth and secured with braided rope. The man directing the unloading was tall, narrow-shouldered, dressed in a gray work coat that reached to his shins. His movements were precise and unhurried. When the truck left at dusk, the canvas bundles had been carried inside, and the man stood in the doorway of number 42 for a long moment, looking not outward at the street, but upward, as though calculating the angle of some trajectory only he could trace. That night, Elias noticed the house was dark. He thought nothing of it. People went to bed early. People forgot to unpack their lamps. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at his kitchen window. Number 42 was visible from the kitchen, diagonal across the street, and looked and saw nothing and went to bed. The second night, still dark. But this time there was movement. Elias had woken at 3 in the morning to a sound he initially took for the house settling. A rhythmic scraping, low and patient, like a thumbnail drawn slowly across rough fabric, repeated and repeated and repeated. He lay in bed for several minutes, listening, before he understood that the sound was not coming from inside his own walls, but from the street. He went to the window. The man from number 42 was on his hands and knees in the front garden. Not in the garden exactly, but at the point where the front walk met the foundation, pressed against the base of the house, and he was sanding. Elias could see the long strokes of the sandpaper in the moonlight, back and forth, the same stretch of brick and concrete, over and over. The corners of the foundation, Elias realized. The man was sanding the corners smooth. He worked without a flashlight, without a lamp, in the complete dark of a moonlit street, and the sound of it carried clear and dry in the cold air. Elias watched for 20 minutes. The man never stopped, never looked up, never varied his stroke. At some point, and Elias could not have said when precisely it began, only that it was already happening when he noticed it, the man began to whisper. Not to himself, to the bricks. Elias could see his lips moving against the surface of the foundation, his mouth almost touching the stone. And the whispers were not in any language Elias recognized, but had a regularity, a pattern, the cadence of a lullaby or a calibration. Elias went back to bed. He told himself the man was an eccentric. He told himself the world was full of them. The third night smelled of wet plaster. Elias noticed it when he stepped outside to collect his mail at 9 in the evening. A warm, mineral smell, thick and chalky, the smell of walls being remade. Number 42 was still dark. He stood on his porch and breathed in and tried to locate the source, but the smell seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the air itself, from the seams between things. He went to bed at 11. At 2:40 in the morning, he was woken not by sound, but by the absolute absence of it. The street had gone perfectly, pressurized quiet, the kind of silence that isn't silence at all, but the auditory equivalent of a held breath. He lay still for a moment, And then he noticed that the ceiling was wrong. The ceiling of his bedroom had always had a small crack in the northeast corner, a hairline fracture from when the previous owner had hung a ceiling fan improperly. Elias had looked at that crack every night for 8 years. It was gone. More than gone. The plaster was smooth, in a way plaster should not be smooth. Smooth in the way of skin or the inside of a shell. A smoothness that had no texture, no grain, no record of having been made. He reached up and touched it. It was warm. He got out of bed. The hallway was different. He knew the hallway. 14 feet from his bedroom door to the top of the stairs, then 11 steps down to the foyer. He had measured it once, compulsively, in the early weeks of his tenancy, when the divorce was still close, and measuring things had felt like a way of insisting that the world was still accountable to facts. 14 feet, 11 steps. The hallway was longer. Not dramatically longer. Not the kind of longer you could point to and say there, at that point, it extended. But the stairs, when he reached them, were further than they should have been. And there were 12 steps now, instead of 11. And the 4th step from the bottom, the one that had always creaked, no longer creaked. And the newel post at the bottom was on the left instead of the right. He stood at the bottom of the stairs in the dark, and breathed through his nose and smelled the plaster, richer now, almost cloying, the smell of a house being revised from the inside. The door at the end of the foyer, which had always opened to the attached garage, opened instead to a room. Elias stood in the doorway and looked in. The room was white and empty, roughly the size of a large closet, with no windows and no other doors and walls that met the ceiling in curves rather than corners. Every angle sanded smooth, every junction rounded to the same subtle radius. The ceiling overhead was very slightly lower in the center than at the edges, like the interior of a lung. There was no light source, and yet he could see clearly, the way you can sometimes see clearly in a dream, by a light that has no origin and casts no shadow. He backed away from the door. He went to the front window. Number 42 was active. The man in the gray coat was on the roof now, moving in the patient, methodical way of a craftsman deep in a job he understands thoroughly. He had a long implement, a pole or a bow, and he was drawing it across the ridge of the roof in long, even strokes. And the sound that Elias now heard, that he had been hearing for some time without identifying it, was not scraping. It was the sound of a string being drawn, slow and deliberate, the lowest note imaginable, a tone too deep to be called sound, and too structured to be called noise, more like a sustained pressure at the base of the skull. And then Elias understood, in the way you understand things in the dark and the cold and the smell of wet plaster, the way understanding sometimes arrives not as an idea, but as a physical fact, a change in the weight of the air. The man was not renovating number 42. He was tuning it. By morning, the geometry of Eldritch Gardens had changed beyond recovery. Elias stood on his porch in the gray early light and looked up the street and saw that the houses, identical, white, perfect, had moved closer together. Not in the way of optical illusions, but in the way of actual fact. The gaps between them, which had each been exactly 12 feet, were now perhaps 9, perhaps 7, and the houses themselves seemed to be leaning infinitesimally toward one another. The roof lines tilting by degrees too small to measure, but too consistent to dismiss, all of them angling in the same direction, toward number 42, which stood at the center of the block, the way a tuning fork stands at the center of a scale. He walked to the Pattersons' house. He knocked. Gerald Patterson opened the door, and Elias looked past him and saw that the Pattersons' hallway was the same as his own hallway. Not similar, identical, the same length, the same smoothed plaster, the same absent crack at the ceiling's edge. and he asked Gerald if he'd slept all right. And Gerald said he had, yes, better than usual actually, very deeply. And his eyes were calm in the way of someone who has been adjusted. Elias went back to his house and through the door at the end of the foyer and into the white room. It was larger than it had been at 2:40 in the morning. He walked to its far wall and put his palm flat against the plaster and felt it vibrate. A sustained, very low vibration, the frequency of the deep tone from the roof of number 42, conducted through the shared architecture of the block, through the foundations and the load-bearing walls and the sanded smooth corners that had, he now understood, always been channels rather than boundaries, the right angles having served as blockages, interruptions in a signal that had been trying to transmit since the neighborhood was built, a signal that the man in the gray coat was simply clearing the path for. There were more rooms beyond the white room. He didn't go into them. He stood at the threshold and looked and saw that the next room had a door on its far side. And through that door, another room, and through that, another. And on, white and smooth and gently curved, the interior dimension of number 42 connected to his own house through the reed-drawn geometry of the street. The houses not merging exactly but aligning, finding a common interior that had always existed beneath their separate exteriors, the way a chord is not three separate sounds, but one sound with a structure. He heard the man working, not from the street now, but from somewhere inside the extended corridor of connected rooms. The rhythmic scraping, moving through the walls, the way sound moves through water, omnidirectional and sourceless. And then the whispering, closer than before. The knot language with its precise cadences, pressing against the plaster from the other side. Elias put both hands on the wall and leaned his forehead against the smooth, cool surface and closed his eyes. He felt the neighborhood breathe. That was the only word for it. A slow, massive respiration. The whole block rising and settling by some invisible fraction. The foundations exhaling, the roof lines at their apex, and then descending. The walls contracting and expanding in a rhythm that was not the rhythm of wind, or temperature, or any mechanical process, but the rhythm of something organic. Something that had been asleep for a long time, and was now, very carefully, being woken. The soul-crushing part, and Elias would think about this for as long as he remained capable of thinking, was not the fear. Fear he had expected. The soul-crushing part was the recognition. The sense, arriving slowly, and then all at once, that Eldritch Gardens had never been a street. It had been an organism in a dormant state, and the identical white houses had been its cells, and the lawns kept to 2 inches had been its skin held in check, and the 11-step front walks had been its bones measured to a tolerance, and everything had been waiting. For how long? Since when? By whose original design? For someone who knew the frequency, who had the instruments, who could find the stuck notes and sand them smooth and whisper the right adjustments to the right surfaces and draw the bow across the ridge of the right roof and wake the whole sleeping body of it from the inside out. He heard the scraping stop. In the silence, the vibration in the walls changed pitch slightly, settling, the way a string settles after tuning, and Elias felt the rooms around him stabilize into their new configuration. Permanent now, irrevocable. The interior of the neighborhood locked into its true and open form. A door opened somewhere in the succession of white rooms ahead of him. Footsteps, patient and even, moving toward him through the living architecture of Eldritch Gardens. Elias stood at the threshold and waited, and the plaster was warm under his palms, and the air tasted of chalk and deep earth, and the neighborhood breathed around him, awake at last, and listening.